We begin in France, where a surge in anti-Semitic violence and hate speech has members of the Jewish community there fearing for their safety. French President Emmanuel Macron has made a very public show of condemning the crimes, which include vandalism of cemeteries, online harassment, and physical attacks. But the public outcry has done little to address the underlying problem. As DW's Catherine Martin reports, many Jews living in France increasingly feel under threat.
Ilan Shalom is preparing for Shabbat. It's Friday, and tonight he's meeting other members of his Jewish congregation. Together they are going to read the Sabbath prayer. The 34-year-old is an active member of the Jewish community here in Paris. Being Jewish is important to him, but so is being French. That's why the increase in violence disturbs him so much.
There are insults, vandalism, and sometimes even cases of murder. For us, that means staying aware and alert and always keeping an eye out. We wouldn't have to do that if we didn't feel threatened. Now we're also asking ourselves, is France really the right place for us?
Around 500,000 Jews live in France, the third largest community behind Israel and the U.S. Last year, there were more than 500 anti-Semitic offenses here, an increase of around 75%. Francis Khalifa, president of the umbrella organization representing France's Jewish community, is also alarmed. He says the real figures are much higher, as not every offense is registered. He's most concerned for the young.
We're noticing that in some regions, Jewish children are no longer going to public schools. They're being pulled out because they can't have a normal school day. They're being insulted, and their physical safety can't always be guaranteed.
Back in the synagogue, young ballerinas are practicing for a big performance. The synagogue offers Jewish children an after-school program, which parents gladly make use of. Delphine Tayeb is the mother of 3 sons. She tells us one of them has moved to Israel because he feels safer being Jewish there. Delphine says she's shocked by the rhetoric she hears. She thought it was a thing of the past. When we hear things like "go back home, Jew," it hurts us deeply. You feel threatened. Ilan Shalom is determined to stay in his homeland, France, despite the worsening situation. Experts say that anti-Semitism is no longer solely coming from right-wing groups, but also from radical Islam. But it rarely has anything to do with religion. Jews often meet hostility because they're seen as being part of an elite. It is the rejection of a community, in this case the Jewish community, that is seen as being privileged, as the group with the most influence on the powerful. Ilan Shalom says he will never conceal the fact that he's Jewish, despite the dangers.
I've never hidden the fact that I'm Jewish, and I won't do that now. When I go to the synagogue for Shabbat, I wear my kippah, and I will continue to do so.
But when it came to the question of whether he would let his own children wear a kippah in public, Ilan couldn't give us an answer.
For more now, I am pleased to welcome Israel's ambassador to Germany, Jeremy Issacharoff, to the studio. Thank you so much for joining us to talk about this topic, because we know that attacks against Jews, it's not only on the rise in France, it's also in many other countries, including Germany, where we know you are the ambassador. Violent attacks are on the rise by 60%. It's been currently documented. How concerned is the Israeli government about this?
First of all, thank you for having me on such an important issue. We're, of course, very concerned about it. As ambassador in Germany, you see a very complicated past merging with a very interesting present and hopefully a good future. And anti-Semitism, in very many ways, is a friend of the horrific past. And today we have to create a new reality. So when we see acts of anti-Semitism, words of anti-Semitism, anti-Semitic acts that translate into violence, of course we're concerned that we're looking back to a much more horrific past.
And we're seeing, one of those acts actually demonstrated here on the wall behind us. I mean, this is basically a cemetery where we see swastikas painted. It's a scene that has unfortunately not become uncommon here in Europe. And in condemning this, we know that your country, your immigration minister, has actually called on Jews, in France in particular, to immigrate to Israel. Mm-hmm. Is that really the solution?
No, I think, first of all, immigrating to Israel, I was born in England and I went to live in Israel and I made my own personal decision. And every Jew should see Israel as his homeland, should he want to come. But I think to deal with anti-Semitism, you need to deal with many things on the ground in Europe, in places where it exists. And it's not only in Europe, we've seen it acts in Latin America and also in America. So I think that we need to think about how we use education, how we use to get some regulation of the cyberspace in terms of how people's messages are proliferated and how anti-Semitic themes are perpetuated in these areas, how we bring this to not only to schools, but to universities, to cultural institutes, how we also have, I think one of the most important things is the issue of enforcement. When people do these horrific acts of putting swastikas in such holy and sacred places that don't offend anyone, this is such a horrific thing. And there needs to be very clear and strict enforcement.
How do you build those structures? Because, the reality is that people are moving to Israel, people who are afraid, Jews who are afraid. And the statistics, if we just look at them, they actually say that anti-Semitism is lower in countries with bigger Jewish populations. But, if the population becomes less here in Europe, that's also an issue, isn't it?
Yes, and I'm sure the German government, as it said, they don't only have a commissioner to fight anti-Semitism, but and also to promote Jewish life. And again, I think that this is, for us to see Jewish life being established also in Europe and to flourish here is an indication of Europe's political health. Today, anti-Semitism is an assault on Jews, it's an assault on Israelis, but in the end, it's also an assault on the democratic, tolerant nature of European society as a whole, and particularly also in Germany.
Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon to share your views on this. Ambassador to Germany, Israeli ambassador to Germany, Jeremy Issacharoff, we appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Well, for more now, I'm joined by DW correspondent Tanya Kramer, who's in Jerusalem. Tanya, I understand that you met a Jewish family who took the step of leaving France and moving to Israel. Tell us more.
Yeah, what we just heard in the report was a bit echoed by the family that I met here. They made Aliyah or emigrated to Israel 5 years ago. They told me that it was a long held dream of them to come to Israel. They had all kind of different reasons, to thinking of moving to Israel, but that the situation at the time in France gave them somehow the final push, to go ahead with their plans. So let's have a look at their story, how they're doing today, and what they are saying of the events today in Europe and in their former homeland of France.
Even from a distance in their new home in Israel, the news about anti-Semitic incidents in France is upsetting. Rami Tujman and his eldest daughter Judith follow the developments back in their homeland closely.
If I compare what I see in 2019 with the last 20 years in France, I can see that the situation has become really difficult there.
Maybe the situation has really changed. We were still very young when we lived there. But we shouldn't forget that France is a country that is still rather tolerant, and we shouldn't forget its positive sides.
DW visited the family in 2014 in a suburb of Paris, shortly before they emigrated to Israel. The family had thought about making Aliyah to Israel for a long time and waited for a good moment to move with their 3 children. Ashdod, a port city in southern Israel, became their new home.
In the beginning, it was a long-held dream to go to Zion. to go to Jerusalem. Later, the rise in incidents, the whole situation which deteriorated with regards to the Jewish community, gave us a push to finally go ahead with it. If you want, it gave us a sort of pretext to finally go for it.
While Israeli politicians regularly call on Jews living abroad to come to Israel in light of attacks or anti-Semitism, it does not always result in more emigration. After a peak in 2015 with over 7,000 French Jews coming to Israel, numbers have fallen to about 2,600 in 2018.
Anti-Semitism is always in the background of considerations of people who decide to move, but I can't say it's the single push factor that determines everything. And that's why we have seen lower numbers of arrivals from France in recent years.
In Ashdod, the Turjmans had to adapt to a new life. It also comes with new responsibilities. Daughter Judith has to do her obligatory military service.
In the beginning, it wasn't easy. It was a whole integration process with the new language, the culture, and everything else. But now everything has become normal. Everyone here plays a part in Israeli society.
Of course, I think I've done the right thing to come here. I've done the right thing for my children. I wouldn't say I saved them, that's not the case. But in my mind, I know I saved them from this constant feeling of numbness and insecurity.
After 5 years in Israel, they feel at home. It's a new life, complete with new challenges. But it is a price they're willing to pay for their future.
Tanya, how much concern is there in Israel about the increase in anti-Semitic attacks here in Europe?
Well, on the one hand, I mean, Europe is far, but it's also close. I mean, far in the sense that people, of course, in Israel, they don't, experience this kind of, those kind of incidents. But many people here do have family relations. They also travel there. So, of course, there is concern of what's going on there. And people follow also closely the events over there. Of course, we do hear, as we heard in the report, there are always politicians here calling for Jews to come back here to their homeland in light of attacks or anti-Semitism, but that is not always translated in numbers. And Jewish agency officials that I talk to here say it's, people have very individual reasons also to come here, and making Aliyah is not such a thing that you do from one day to the next. But I think what people here are saying is that they want to see what European governments are actually doing, to counter those developments, and what measures they're taking in this situation.
Tanya, thank you. DW's Tanya Kramer there in Jerusalem.